Welcome, and thank you once again for being here at this 8th Annual Emerging Markets Forum. I'm Rebecca Bellinger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Global Business here at the Smith School, and I'm delighted to be with you here all today, and especially with my esteemed panelists. Before I go ahead and introduce our panelists, I'd like to frame a little bit about what we're going to be trying to do in this final session of the day. So for most of the day, we've been talking about really a macro outlook for the continent. And what we'd like to do is shift a little bit, take the conversation about investment and policy and try to explore what that means on a day-to-day operational basis for U.S. companies that are actually operating currently in the African continent. So here to talk more about this specific topic, I'm joined with Dr. Kimberly Brown, Kevin Tanzola, and Jeff Krilla. So there are bios on the website, and in the interest of time, I'll just give some very, very brief introductions and then ask the panelists to give us some more information and context. So Kimberly is the founder and CEO of Amethyst Technologies. She was appointed by the Secretary of Commerce to the President's Advisory Council for Doing Business in Africa in 2016. She also serves on the Board of Advisors for the University of Maryland's Clark School of Engineering and is a member of the External Advisory Board for Maryland's Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department. And she's a Terp. She completed her PhD and MS in Chemical Engineering at the Clark School. Next to her is Kevin. Kevin is the Vice President of Financial Operations for the Middle East and Africa region at Marriott International. He currently resides in Dubai and oversees finance operations for the over 300 Marriott hotels in the Middle East and African continent. And what's more, he's also a Terp. He completed his MBA from the Smith School at Maryland. And I do have to say that Kevin receives the award for traveling the farthest to be with us today. I believe just a matter of 4 hours or so, he got off a plane from Dubai to be here. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And last but not least, certainly is Jeff Krilla. Jeff is the Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs at Kosmos Energy. In 2016, he was instrumental in engineering the agreement between the governments of Senegal and Mauritania, leading to the $1 billion partnership between Kosmos and BP. Jeff is a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the Atlantic Council and the United States Trade Representatives Trade Advisory Committee on Africa. He also sits on the board of directors for Africare. He holds a JD, not from Maryland, but from the Georgetown University Law Center. Yeah. We'll make you an honorary Terp today. So there are 5 main topics we'll cover today. First being the experience of our panelists. What has the experience been in Africa? We'll look at misconceptions of doing business in Africa. We'll look at competition, opportunities, challenges, and risks. So my first question for all of you is, tell us a little bit more about your backgrounds, especially the nature of your businesses, and your experience in Africa. And Kimberly, why don't we do ladies first?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about doing business in Africa. So my company focuses on setting up laboratories, improving the quality of healthcare delivery in the U.S., Africa, and Middle East. So just to tell you a little bit about how we ended up in Africa, we were working with U.S. Army. Walter Reed was our first client in 2007. And we had a contract to support quality assurance for vaccine manufacturing at Walter Reed. And the project went well. And one day we were approached by our contract officer and we were asked, are you interested in going to Tanzania? And as a small business, right, we were probably 5 or 6 people, never really thought about doing business in Africa, but we were given the opportunity. And of course, I said, yes, sure, why not? And so we were given a contract to run Walter Reed's malaria research program in Tanzania, to work with 21 healthcare facilities, Tanzania military healthcare facilities, and improve the quality of malaria diagnostics to support U.S. Army vaccine trial. And the project went very well. It was an eye-opener. You know, as a small business, you too can look at ways to export, to grow, to make a difference, not only in your community or in the U.S., but looking at the global opportunities. And we ran that project for 7 years. And it opened up other countries, other opportunities, other markets for Amethyst Technologies.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much. Great to be here. Seeing many of you and always be back in the States is always a good time. I do live in Dubai and just came in this morning, so it's I appreciate the Arabic-themed lunch that we had today. Thank you very much. Thought I was back home in Dubai for a moment there. So a little bit about Marriott International, in particular where we operate hotels in Africa. Right now we have 137 hotels operating on the continent of Africa. That crosses about 20 different countries. And if we think about Marriott International having 30 different brands out there, we have 12 of those 30 brands today in Africa. I do oversee the Middle East and Africa, so I am probably the new kid on the block up here. I've only been in my position in Dubai for about 3 years, but I can tell you, having visited many of the countries and hotels, interacting with a lot of the associates at those hotels, it is a fantastic and very exciting place to do business. I will tell you, the first trip I took to Africa, having just come from our London office, was we went to Cairo as my first inauguration into Africa, and to get the experience of the sights and the sounds and the people, and most importantly, the traffic in that city. If you haven't been there, it is something that you can really appreciate being back here in Maryland and DC. And so that hotel was actually Marriott's first hotel that had opened in Africa in 1983. And for those of you that may know, Marriott and Starwood came together about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago now. Starwood was actually in Africa about 12 years earlier with the Sheraton Cairo there that just recently reopened. If we go into the sub-Saharan portion and talk about hotel development there, it took Marriott, 2016 is when we opened our first Marriott hotel in Rwanda, in Kigali. So again, you talk about being on the continent for several years, but yet we're still newcomers into that sub-Saharan space. So certainly a lot to learn, but great to be here. Thank you very much.
Great, and thanks again, Rebecca, and thanks for having me here, University of Maryland. I am properly ashamed at not being a Terp, but I will say on a Maryland-related note, I just had a meeting with our outgoing U.S. ambassador to Gabon and Sao Tome, who is a very proud Terp, and we were talking about the good old days. I'm a Georgetown grad. We were talking about the good old days of Maryland in the ACC and Georgetown in the very different Big East, and the great rivalry we had with both our teams were very good at basketball, which seems like a very, very long time ago now.
Oh, no.
So as Rebecca said, I'm with Kosmos Energy, and we're a fairly small, by industry standards, oil and gas exploration company. We're about a $3 billion company. We're based in Dallas, Texas, but on the African continent, where we have most of our work, we're most well known for having found the oil and gas reserves in Ghana, which unlocked a huge part of the Ghanaian economy. We also, as Rebecca had said, we recently found large gas reserves, natural gas reserves off the coast of Senegal and Mauritania. And we're also operating in Sao Tome and Equatorial Guinea. So these are challenging places, but we go where the oil and gas is, and we can talk more about that later, but we've had a great experience. We consider ourselves an African company because we work there so often, or in so many places. In terms of my own background, just to give you a quick snapshot, I've been working in Africa about 25 years now. My first exposure after graduating from Georgetown, where I did study African studies, was working in then apartheid South Africa. I lived in a hut. I taught school out in the bush. You know, when I tell people that, especially young students, they sound, I sound like a dinosaur, like I was cutting through the bush with Livingston and Stanley. But it actually wasn't all that long ago for those of us that have worked on Africa for decades, and it was a great exposure, first exposure to Africa. From there, I went and worked on Capitol Hill for about a decade, working on Africa policy and also just in the, sort of in the political mix. And then I've been on the continent and working on African issues, both as a military officer, government official. I went over to the State Department with Condoleezza Rice, worked on a lot of African initiatives there, helped negotiate the Darfur Peace Agreement, if you can remember that. And then ultimately, over the last 9 years, have been in the private sector. So in many ways, my own experience, both in terms of development professional, government to government, and now private sector reflects the changing nature of the African economy. So I feel particularly well positioned to talk about the changes at least I've seen and certainly learn from the other panelists. But thanks again for having me here today.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. You've each mentioned or touched on this a little bit, this idea of why Africa. So there was a contract that was the first thing that brought you into the continent, and then, Jeff, you go where the oil and gas is. But you're all very different companies doing very different things. Why Africa? What keeps you there? Sure.
So I guess I'll start. So for us, as a small business, our market in the U.S. is saturated in many instances. We have to compete against large organizations. We're one of the few small businesses that provides technical assistance in health and laboratories. So going to Africa offered us an opportunity where there we're not viewed as a small business, we're viewed as these are the services and resources that we provide. We're first seen as a U.S. company, and there's a demand for U.S. services, U.S. goods because of the quality of what we do, our commitment to making sure we leave something behind and we improve in any community that we work in is something that is quite part of every business in the U.S. So just, the demand. And with our company working in Tanzania for U.S. Army, as a small business, that gave us a leg up because we were known as defense contractors. We deliver, we get the job done, and the governments appreciated that. So going to Ghana, so we started off in Tanzania, we were able to go to Ghana. We interacted with the Ghana Armed Forces, talked about the work we do to support the health of the warfighter, and then any country that we went to, we were able to just lead with that. And that gave us credibility, and that also really helped us expand into private sector opportunities, working for like the government of Kenya. Hired us to help build capacity for cancer diagnostics in Bomet County, and working with USAID, Department of State, and other organizations. So for Africa, for us in Africa, we currently have offices in Ghana and Tanzania, and about 75% of our business is done on the continent. So going from a small business where all of our work was at Walter Reed, Fort Detrick, Aberdeen, to now 75% of our work is in Africa. Shows you the opportunity.
What about Marriott?
Yeah, I think for Marriott, it kind of goes back to what Dr. Signe's slide had, and it wasn't just that line on food and beverage that we're going after. I think it was really talking about that growing middle class, that young population, certainly the demand and the need for travel, and certainly quality travel and accommodation when we think about going into some of these countries where a lot of people are going for the first time, and be that for business or be that for leisure, they're looking for that element of, yes, I know I'm going there for the first time, but I have all the resources and respect of a global brand such as Marriott. I know what I'm getting when I go there. I will say that, for Marriott, we were thinking about expanding our African footprint probably back in 2013. And for those of you that know probably more around South Africa, Protea Hotels had about 116 hotels at the time, and Marriott purchased them back in 2014. And that really put us on the map in terms of getting that footprint, because as you'll hear, certainly the competitors are out there. They're looking to grow, they're looking to expand in hospitality. And so with that, that put us as the largest operator in the African continent for hotels.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, I was half joking when I said we go where the oil and gas is. I mean, that's certainly the case. Mm-hmm. But in terms of why working in Africa, I think some of the slides, I think that Kevin made a good point. Some of the slides that Landry put up were very informative about just reminding me why we're working on this continent. Part of it is you've got the challenges of sort of overcoming misconceptions about about how difficult it is to work in Africa. And then secondly, you've got the great opportunities. You've got this competitive index that shows there's massive opportunities to be had on the continent. Now, we're not a consumer, well, I mean, ultimately we're a consumer good, but in terms of our efforts, what the Kosmos will go in, we will procure a block, an offshore block. We will do an exploration program over a couple of years, and then if we find oil or gas, we will then sell what we found off to one of the big companies, one of the IOCs, Chevron, or in this case, I think BP. We've got a strong partnership. So what that means is we have a lot of interactions with the governments and with the people. I think one of the reasons we pride ourselves on being an Africa company, and one of the reasons I love working for Kosmos after spending so many years on the continent, is the governments, the people are very open, are very keen on investment and partnerships. And if you're a company that's willing to, take the time to spend time in these countries and really get to know the cultures, know that it's just not one big country. It's very diverse countries, economies, cultures, fascinating places. I think you can really succeed there. So I think that's why in addition to going where the assets are, where the resources are, is why we work on the continent.
So you've made pretty good cases as to why your companies are in Africa. And yet the other side of that is there aren't that many U.S. companies doing business in Africa. I think that Kisleya mentioned earlier that the engagement, the investment of U.S. companies into the continent is on the decline. So what are some of the misconceptions that you find either among your peers in the service industry or health industry, hospitality? What is it that you're facing when you're talking to your peers about misconceptions of doing business in the continent?
So for Amethyst, we're focused on healthcare, building laboratories, urgent care facilities throughout Africa. And one of the misconceptions that we often hear is there's no market for healthcare services delivery. Currently, many countries depend on aid. So USAID and DFID and JICA. But if you look at the amount of out-of-pocket expenses that are incurred, for example, in Liberia and Sierra Leone, 2010, there were $100 million plus of out-of-pocket health expenses. 85%, 95% of all health expenses are out-of-pocket. So there's an opportunity in those two countries where there's less than 200 doctors combined. Currently, Liberia, 25, 50 doctors. Sierra Leone, under 100 doctors. So people are spending money. How are they spending healthcare dollars? They're spending it on medications that may not be what they need because they haven't seen a doctor. There's few labs providing proper accredited diagnostics. So there's a tremendous opportunity in healthcare. If you look at what happened with Ebola in 2014 in Liberia, where failure to strengthen the healthcare, not only does it impact health, but it impacts business. Most companies shut down, with the exception of the hospitality industry, which was supporting all of the donors and everyone who was coming into the country to help eradicate the disease. So healthcare is a critical need, and there's an opportunity for private sector investment. Earlier, we saw the data with the growth, the number of young people, the growth of the middle class. So that's one of the things that is a challenge for us, is really trying to define a market when there's not a lot of data, not a lot of research, not a lot of hard figures on market analysis and healthcare.
Okay, thanks.
I think for hospitality, it's really, and we got to step back for a minute and understand the model of hospitality. So Marriott, like Hilton, like Hyatt, has what they call an asset-light model, meaning that you have a third-party ownership that actually owns the building and the land, and Marriott or Hyatt or Hilton comes in to manage that asset for the owner. And so when we start looking at Africa and you hear about those misconceptions, certainly it raises challenges about a U.S. company. Can I get my money out? Can I get my fees that I collect for running that hotel? Can I find the talent and the staffing down there? You know, in some countries we go into, we have to spend a lot of time training. And that means you have to bring in expat workers to do that training. And that can be difficult and challenging. And more so, I think, with the individuals, especially if they haven't been to a certain country. They have that perception of safety, security, you know, being able to have a family down there while I'm helping train and build this hotel. And so I think those are the realities of what we have to deal with in that perception when we go into a market, especially if we don't have the experience there that we have in the hospitality industry.
Great. Jeff, let me ask you a more pointed question along those lines of misconceptions. We heard earlier in the day this idea of talking about extraction industries. So there's this idea when a lot of people think about the African continent, they think about extracting natural resources for profit from foreign companies. Gold, oil, certainly cocoa, diamonds, this kind of thing. But I'm guessing there's a lot more to the story today than maybe there was 50 years ago. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, being now 3 years in the oil and gas industry, I'm not necessarily an expert, but I've learned a lot more than I knew going in. And the industry gets a bit of a bad reputation, and I'd say rightly so, for a behavior for decades, especially many years ago, where, you know, if you had the sign off from from the president, you could go in and do whatever you wanted in countries in terms of resource extraction of resources. And I think that the industry is really much more sophisticated than it used to be. And I'm happy about that, because one of the reasons I joined Kosmos is because we have a commitment to transparency, to business ethics. I think, when I hear the story about extracting resources from Africa, I think it tells such a small part of the story, because I'm partnering with governments that we are paying massive taxes and royalties to. And in a perfect world, those resources will trickle down through to the citizens who will benefit. Now, it's not always the case. I worked, when I was at the State Department, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. So I heard horror stories all over the world, and especially focusing on Africa was particularly sensitive to stories that I was hearing on the continent. But I would say over the last several decades, and especially the last, I'd say, decade, we've seen a great deal more commitment to transparency. We are part of something called the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, so all of our contracts are published online. I would say some of our government partners don't always love that, but I think for us, it's a great way to communicate to the citizens in these countries just how much we're paying in terms of taxes, and journalists, civil society, concerned citizens can follow the trail and see, how much resource the government has benefited from, and hopefully that will see its way to infrastructure projects and other ways into citizens, improving the lives of citizens there. So I think transparency has changed a lot. That's headed off the concerns about corruption, both in Africa and with the companies that have been working in Africa. And I'm very proud to see that. I'm proud to see that there's been a lot more commitment to local communities in areas in which we're working. A lot of the corporate social responsibility enthusiasm has increased over the last decades, and I'd say right now we have an extremely robust CSR plan that works to engage with the communities in which we're working. Whether we're working offshore in Senegal, Mauritania, we're working with the fishermen communities there. We were working in Cameroon in a community that lacked access to clean drinking water. We went and talked to the community, talked about their biggest challenges, and were able to address those in ways that really increased and improved the lives of the communities and those living in the community. So I'm really happy about that, because that has been something that's changed significantly. I will say another misconception to your earlier question, not necessarily related to oil and gas, is this sort of false narrative that exists in the U.S. about Africa. And I would say it's across the board in a number of different areas, but even getting down to physical security. When I talk to folks at our headquarters, not necessarily folks that spend a lot of time in Africa, but they say, "Whoa, you just got back from country X. How was it? It sounds really dangerous." And I say, "You live in Dallas. You want to talk about you have a much better chance. I have a much better chance of getting shot in Dallas than I do in Monrovia or Brazzaville or Dakar." So I think it's the media still has a very unsophisticated narrative for Africa. It's not helpful, and it's changing slightly, But when I hear educated people asking me silly questions like that, I take a moment to explain the irony, especially something like, am I going to get shot in place X, Y, or Z? But I think it's not helpful. It needs to change. I think panels like this are helpful. I think having, education at colleges and high schools and certainly in the mainstream press is very helpful, but it's going to take time. And it's sad to me that 25 years after this, when I started working the continent, I'm still having these silly conversations, but it's important.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's turn the conversation a little bit more toward competition. So I've heard recently this idea or this phrase of a new scramble for Africa. I think there have been a couple of op-eds, and we talked about this when we were preparing for the panel. And if we think about a scramble for Africa, we think, China is the winner so far. China's been investing over $75 billion US in the African continent on an annual basis. So who are you all finding as your main competitors, either foreign or local or national, in each of your industries? And Kevin, why don't we start with you, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So I think all the major U.S. Hotel brands are down in Africa for the most part. I would say probably our closest competitor from that standpoint is Hilton. Hilton has about 40 hotels down there. And if you were paying attention back October of last year, they announced a $50 million investment plan to get their portfolio size up to 100 hotels. And certainly when you start to think about that, where they put their resources, where they put their developers to go into these countries and find a third-party owner to manage their asset for them, that creates competition, and that's a good thing. I think it keeps the industry transparent. Certainly, there's no one major player down there, and then that's just the U.S. side of it. When I look to the other global operators in hospitality, Accor is probably only second to us from the number of hotels that they have. Again, being a French company, they have 96 hotels on the continent across 19 different countries, and their pipeline, again, very robust over the next several years, is to grow and develop their portfolio and scale. So it's certainly a landscape out there that we're very keen to make sure that we stand up resources. We have offices in Cape Town and Dubai where we service the continent from. And when we think about it, some of our other competitors are actually pulling their offices back. They're going back into Europe and back into Asia. And when you start to think about that, you think that gives us an edge being in the continent and being able to make those connections, which are so critically important in any business line down there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. What do you see in terms of competition for Amethyst?
So primarily companies from India. When it comes to laboratories and health, a lot of the African governments will send samples to India for testing. Also, you see that many of the medications are coming from India into sub-Saharan Africa. So the opportunity for U.S. companies is now to really get engaged and look at local partnerships and look at ways to really improve the quality of health. For example, for PEPFAR, the HIV program that's sponsored by the U.S., they purchase approximately $5 billion worth of drugs for AIDS annually. And 70 to 80% of those drugs are manufactured either by companies in China or India. None of those drugs are purchased on the continent. So there's a tremendous opportunity when it comes to pharmaceutical manufacturing and healthcare. If you look at the population growth, 60% of the world's population will reside in Africa by 2050, and drugs aren't manufactured there. They're imported. So looking at those U.S. companies where there's a market that's pretty much untapped when it comes to pharmaceutical laboratories and healthcare in many cases, we see that as an opportunity.
Okay, great. Jeff, what do you think about this new scramble for Africa?
I've got a lot of thoughts. First, an apology, though. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed, I've been checking my phone sporadically. I hate doing that as a panelist, but my wife and I are expecting a daughter any day, maybe any hour. So I'm sorry if I Well, don't cheer yet. We haven't done it. If I'm gone when it happens, I'll be in the doghouse. But anyway, so that's why I'm a little distracted. So apologies first. In terms of competition on the continent, Kosmos Energy is a deep offshore oil and gas exploration company. So we have some very sophisticated technology, and I will say we don't have a lot of competition from countries that have generally been mentioned as those that are giving American industries a run for their money on the continent. There really isn't a Chinese or Indian company that doing the deep offshore work that we're doing presently. I mean, it doesn't mean there won't be sometime soon, but where we work tends to be very specific, very targeted. But I will say our industry, and I've seen also in other industries the challenges of other companies from other parts of the world challenging American companies. But I don't lose a lot of sleep about this, not just because I'm at Kosmos. I see American companies being some of the best in the world at what they do. What does make me lose sleep is when there isn't a transparent bidding process for some of these efforts, and when there is still corruption on the continent. I mean, as you saw from Landry's slides, there's corruption all over the world. I don't think we should ever just talk about corruption in terms of Africa, but I'm an Africanist, I work in Africa, and corruption in Africa bothers me. And it's of concern because I see contracts going to not always the best player in a given bidding process, whether it's our industry or others. So that is a challenge. But I will say, in a transparent process where you've got companies from different parts of the world competing on a level playing field and doing good work, whether they're building roads or hospitals or parliament buildings, I welcome that. When I'm in country X and I'm driving on a road, I don't know if it was built by a Chinese company or a German company or a South African company. I just want there to be a road there, and I'm happy there's a road there. So I think sometimes that fear of scramble for Africa is a little overblown. I think there's enough needs on the continent that honest, ethical players, business players are welcome in all the countries in which I've worked. I worked in 41 countries in Africa, and I can see a lot of needs in every single one of them. So I worry less about a scramble for Africa in terms of who's going to be there, but I do think it's important for us to make sure the processes there are transparent and ethical, and that corruption is stamped out. And I think we're seeing progress in that way.
Okay. Interesting commentary on this. I think thus far we've been talking really about Africa as a continent, and other speakers, I think every speaker up until we have taken the stage has reminded us that Africa is not a monolith, that there is individuality across nations, in culture, society, and economics as well. So, for example, IMF has predicted that Ghana will be the third fastest growing economy in the world with growth rates of over 8%. I see someone waving to us. You must be from Ghana, a couple. Congratulations. And this growth rate is even meant to outpace India and Ethiopia, which has really been the largest growing economy in Africa over the last decade. So first, what are your companies doing in Ghana to harness this growth, this opportunity? And if not Ghana, where else are you seeing at a nation-state level opportunities?
So Amethyst, we are building 2 facilities right now in Ghana. One is a tuberculosis isolation center in Katampo for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The second project, we're building a laboratory in Accra that will provide pilot-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing, testing for health, commercial sectors, ag sectors, and also repository where you can safely, securely store samples. So we see Ghana as a great place to do business from the people. I think one thing that I haven't heard a lot is the people. So going into a country where people are embracing your company, embracing your business, where it's a pleasure to work with them, where you can, interact with universities, and there's so much young talent. So that's what we see, particularly in Ghana. The roads. I started going to Ghana in 2012. I spend about 50% of my time in Ghana. I just came back Monday, so I'm there every other month. We have an office in Accra. So I see a big difference in the roads. When I first started going to Ghana in 2012, the traffic on the road from the airport, the road to Beach Road, you can see that there's a lot of progress when it comes to reducing traffic, which I think is very important. You also see a commitment to standards, working with the Ghana FDA. They become accredited to ISO in most of their laboratories. They are instituting new policies to ensure that the imports meet certain standards. So in Ghana, I've seen quite a bit of progress, more so than many of the other countries that we work with.
Great.
I mean, I love Ghana. I could talk about Ghana forever. The Ghanaian people, I think Kimberly made a great point. It's a wonderful place to do business. It's a wonderful place to go. My first trip to Ghana was in 2001. I was on a congressional delegation with John Lewis and J.C. Watts. And there was a new president elected, President John Kufuor. You had him in a key sort of democratic transition. You had Kofi Annan at the UN. I mean, it was really Ghana starting to really come into its own. And so that was 2 lifetimes ago for me. But ever since then, I've seen Ghanaians taking leadership roles across the continent in terms of NGOs, not just at the highest levels of the UN, but also the NGOs that are doing invaluable work all throughout the continent. I've worked with Ghanaians in Zimbabwe, in Sudan, in DRC. I mean, just a wonderful country and wonderful people. But there's also the good with the bad in terms of the growth. It's been an amazing story. But I've got Ghanaian friends that remind me, older friends, who say, back during independence, our economy was about the same size as South Korea. So for all that Ghana recently has really risen up, he said, I sometimes look at what's happened in South Korea and I think that could have been us. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to be, because things are really moving up. You've got 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in Africa, but these are relatively small economies that have grown significantly, and I certainly hope that they continue to do so. So it's a great story. The story's not over, but the story so far is very promising, especially over the last decade. So Ghana's a great place. Kosmos Energy has really enjoyed working there. There's a president there, President Akufo-Addo, really sharp guy. He's got a terrific team around him. His finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, really sharp, internationally recognized experts, and I think you've got a real sharp team leading. Kosmos initially had done a lot of, has had a lot of luck exporting oil and gas, but now you've got domestic consumption to keep pace, for the economy to keep pace. You've got a lot of domestic needs. So whether it's oil or natural gas, you're seeing the resources are there. Now the government has risen to the challenge, and now the economy has great potential and potential to continue at that growth rate going forward. So I'm jealous. I think Kimberly spends a lot more time in Ghana than I do. But as you can see, I'm very happy with that. The Black Star soccer team, just amazing. Although this year, both the U.S. and Ghana not making the World Cup. Sad, and a bit of an aberration, at least for Ghana, maybe not for the U.S. But a great place to work, a great place to visit, and very welcoming.
Sure. Great. What about Marriott? Any plans in Ghana or other countries
Sure.
in the continent?
Yeah, so we have one hotel operating there today under Protea, and we're getting ready this year to open our first Marriott in Accra. So that's exciting. We also have in our pipeline probably one more, a Le Meridian hotel from the Starwood portfolio that will be opening there as well. So we're looking forward to that. I think when we start to look across other countries, certainly Kenya is a country that we're very interested in and have some great deals coming up in there. Mozambique, Uganda, Liberia, I'll mention today Botswana, Tanzania, and then we talk about North Africa and the continuation of South Africa as well. So certainly there's probably more countries out there than I'd like to list in terms of growth and development, but our developers are doing a fantastic job. Like we said, we see this as a really untapped market, especially when it comes to hospitality and getting our hotels and brands into those countries.
Mm-hmm. Great. And as Marriott is a large company, global brand, one of the things that we work with our students is this idea of, as you're entering new markets, how do you maintain your brand pillars while at the same time meeting the needs or adapting to the culture or local needs of of wherever it is that you're entering?
Sure. So it's a great point and it's a great question because, as I mentioned earlier, Marriott has 30 brands globally, 12 of which are on the African continent. And this really comes down to the education. When we go into a market when we're looking at a hotel, Marriott has very, what I'll call, uncompromising standards when it comes to the physical layout of the hotel, or the size of the room, or the certain things that you expect to be there. If Jeff goes to the bar, he needs to have his drink of choice at the bar. And that's very important in terms of making sure that we can deliver on those standards that customers expect to do. There's 110 million loyalty members with Marriott Rewards, Ritz-Carlton Rewards, and SPG. Those members, when they travel, and they do travel to Africa, they expect certain things to be done at the hotel. So part of our developer's job is they're meeting that owner to talk about running their hotel, is to educate them on that aspect and that element. Now that said, I think where we can get into the African experience and really take that hospitality and that warm welcome and that produce that Africa is certainly known for, and those flavors in the food and the soya in Nigeria, and introduce that into the customer is really when they enter the door. And that's where, again, we go back to hiring local talent, making sure that they're trained, but yet they can share their stories, their experiences, and really give that African welcome that we're looking for and our customers are looking for.
Okay. And Kimberly, from your point of view, you work in one of the most highly regulated industries in the United States, really healthcare, essentially. Can you compare working in this industry in the U.S. with any African countries?
It's very different, and it's been a learning experience. So in the U.S., where quality assurance, compliance, and healthcare it's a requirement. Many of the countries we work in, they have an immature quality system, where they may have a system in place that's not enforced completely, or in some instances, they don't have a system in place. So you have to really look at what you're marketing, what you're selling, and who you're selling it to. And each country that we work in is very, very different. So initially we would go in, our company, we provide support for ISO accreditation. And we're talking to countries that may not have a laboratory, may not have standards in place. So they're not at the point where they're looking at accreditation. So we really had to tailor our pitch, look at our services, and look at our offerings, and change the way we approach quality assurance and compliance. But one thing across the board, every country that we've dealt with, they have a need they understand the need and the importance of the services that we offer, which is the first step.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I have one final question for you all. This has been a fantastic conversation before I turn it over to the audience for questions. And I'd like to focus selfishly on the business of the Center for Global Business. We are in the business of training students and preparing them to be the next generation of global business leaders. So if you had any tips or guidance, maybe one from each of you to inspire any of the students in the audience who are interested in working in the African continent, what would that piece of advice be? Jeff?
Well, I think sometimes I'll speak on panels and folks will read my bio and someone will come up to me afterwards and be like, wow, you had such a great plan. You knew that you'd be doing this, and it looks like it all plan came together, but there was no plan. Like, I think the...
Students don't listen to that.
Well, okay, let's say there was no plan set in stone. Let's say that. How about that? Because even when I came back from Africa, I thought, oh, that was great. I spent a year there, great experiences, wonderful people, and I sort of closed that chapter on my life. But then, I had many opportunities over the years to continue to stay engaged in Africa. And at a certain point, I became, I hate to use the term expert, but let's say experienced working in Africa. And because I always kind of was nimble and kind of kept my eye open for the next great opportunity while trying to do the best at the things where I was at the time, I had a very varied career, but it sort of built, the career each job was built upon the previous jobs I had. So keep your eyes open for great opportunities. Don't be set in your ways. I had a couple of degrees here and there that have been helpful. I went to law school, not that I'm recommending that to anyone, but it's, it was a useful degree. I spent some time in the military, which helped not only shape me, but shape my worldview, but also helped get the military better experience and expertise in terms of Africa, in terms of my role there. But I would say have a plan, but be flexible.
Okay.
And there's a great number of opportunities there across various industries, sectors, government, NGO, private sector. It's a wonderful place to work, but just keep your eyes open.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kevin.
So I completely agree with Jeff. You got to be flexible. In hospitality, we're looking for that spirit to serve, right? You got to want to help someone out. And that's certainly very, very important for us as a company, and certainly the industry as a whole. The one thing I will say, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up a good example that we did in Rwanda. So the Aquila Institute for Women is actually a college down in Rwanda that gives hospitality degrees. And so in 2012, now keep in mind, we just opened our first hotel there in 2016. So 2012, we partnered with them and actually took their graduates from the hospitality, and we brought them to our hotels in Dubai and Doha to work there and to get that hands-on experience. So fast forward to 2016, when we opened the Kigali Marriott, we actually had 25 of those graduate students working in managerial and supervisory roles. And that, to me, is something that you really have to embrace the local talent. Yet, if you're sitting here in this room and thinking about, do I want to have a job or career in hospitality, I'll tell you it's more than just food and beverage or cleaning rooms or checking people in at the front desk. There's HR, there's IT, there's finance and accounting. So many, many disciplines can certainly have in a very adventurous career. And like Jeff said, keep an open mind, be flexible, and go for the adventure. It is quite rewarding.
Great. Thank you. And Kimberly.
So for companies that are interested in getting involved in regulated markets, Africa offers a unique opportunity because of the ease of getting drugs through, medical devices approved. So for example, we've worked with small businesses, with large businesses in the US that instead of going first for US FDA approval, which takes a decade and $30 million or plus, depending on what it is you're doing, we've helped them get into Ghana market, where you may be able to get approval in a matter of months at a much lower cost, under $100,000. So definitely look at Africa as an opportunity for regulated markets. Also be prepared. Be prepared, have a local partner. A lot of what was mentioned as challenges, if you have a local partner, you can mitigate many of the challenges. So working with the U.S. government, Department of Commerce offers free and low-cost resources for U.S. businesses. We use them all the time. So get involved, meet with them, find out what resources they have, help them, help you identify qualified local partners is key, and be patient. Have resources. Have resources that will be able to last the long haul. Be committed. Don't necessarily expect that where something may take 2 years here, it might take 5 years or more there. We've been working on our lab project for this, I guess, our 6th year. And we meet large organizations, small organizations that have been working on projects for a decade. So they've had to go through numerous changes of government. So definitely be prepared to deal with that, be committed to really invest in Africa.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel. And with that, we'll open questions to the audience. And as a reminder, there are 2 floor mics, so you are welcome to head to the mic to address your question.
I've been dying to ask it for each session. My name is Yvonne Captain. I'm at George Washington University. I teach Latin American and International Affairs. And lately, my research has been on South-South relations between Latin America and Africa. And I didn't hear Brazil come up. I didn't hear Argentina come up. But when you were talking about competitiveness and the new scramble for Africa, 10 years ago, I would have bet that Brazil, particularly Brazil under Lula, and Argentina would have given both the United States and even China a run for their money. Now with the political setbacks, the economic issues, maybe not so much in Latin America, but they are there, bringing more embassies, they're bringing more consulates, they're bringing their businesses there. So I'm wondering if any of you feel a sort of a competitiveness with Latin American companies and governments.
Who wants to take it?
So, for example, in Ghana, you see Brazil companies are more and more active construction projects. You see that infrastructure. But in Ghana, definitely see the dominance of China, Lebanese, as far as a lot of the commercial sector. They typically own the grocery stores. Most of the stores are Lebanese owned. So I don't know. I don't have anything else to add to that question.
I think it'd be great to have more Brazilian companies. I mean, Brazil's a massive economy. They've got some very sophisticated corporations. Especially, there's 5 Lusophone countries in Africa. Not to limit them to those, but it's challenging for American businesses to work in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau, well, particularly in Guinea-Bissau, but in Sao Tome, where my company is working, it is a challenge. The language, culturally, it's not that big of a deal, but I mean, it's challenging everywhere. Different cultures all over the continent, all over the world, but the language is particularly challenging. So having Brazilians, I started an office in Angola and Mozambique. I was happy to bring in Brazilians to work in those offices because they had the language. I mean, Brazilians are awesome anyway, right? I mean, they're always lively and always fun to have part of any operation, but I would say we particularly valued their language abilities as well as their professional demeanor. So once again, I'm not somebody that wants to exclude other countries, and competition I think is a good thing. This country has a lot of benefits because of our competitive nature of our economy, and I think to share that in Africa is a blessing for the continent. So I say bring on everybody. There's plenty of work to be done.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Joel. I'm a visiting scholar from the Institute for African Studies at GW. So my question is actually to the Amethyst technology. You said a lot about what you do in helping bring U.S. companies to Africa, particularly in the healthcare sector. So my question is, how do you steward the opportunities that Africa provides for you responsibly? So sort of acting back to the Pfizer issue in Nigeria, way back in 1990, where there were a lot of healthcare equipment and medicines that were shipped to northern Nigeria by U.S. companies. But the effect of that is still ongoing for decades later. So there's opportunity in Africa, but I would like to hear about responsible stewardship of those opportunities.
So our focus on laboratories, we see labs as an area that is very overlooked because labs are required to test products. So to test drugs that are coming into the country, the government needs to have labs so they can do testing. They also need to have standards which they test against. So our core business is really addressing exactly what you mentioned, because strengthening the governance of the government's ability to do testing, making sure that they have proper protocols in place so that no substandard drugs will get into their market is, the reason why we're building the lab in Ghana. So I think, the public-private partnerships are opportunities to address those types of concerns, but also really strengthening the government's ability to actually enforce, develop, and implement standards is key. And then getting more U.S. companies really involved, competition. Because when you have competition, then substandard products, it's more difficult for them to get to the market. When you have fair practices for bidding, where drugs get to the market based on a competitive bid process, where organizations are audited, the government should be going and auditing companies that are actually bringing drugs into their countries. So our core business is really addressing those types of things. We work a lot with malaria. There was a study in 2012 where 70% of the anti-malarials in Ghana were counterfeit. And malaria is the #1 disease threat for the U.S. military, for African militaries. It kills more children than any other disease. So, and if you think of the number of substandard drugs. So there's a tremendous opportunity for U.S. businesses to really address those type of concerns. There are several businesses that are working with, I think, Pfizer and some other pharmaceutical companies to develop technologies using like ICT technologies where they're actually tracking counterfeit drugs and making sure that drugs are the proper strength. So I think, does that answer your question?
Great. And maybe we'll do one more question if there is a brief one. Yep. Okay, we'll hear a fun question.
Whatever you guys want to say. Hi, I'm Nancy Taylor of the Taylor Group 500. We're a business coaching and consulting company, and I am also a TERP. But
Excellent.
I graduated from the business school before it was the Smith Business School. It was that long ago. and I'm also a former Marriott employee. So what I'm curious about, I've been reading Tom Peters' newest book, The Excellence Dividend, and I'd also gone through Eric Ries's The Startup Way. And in both of those books, they're encouraging us to stop using terms like human capital and human resources, because we tend to look at people as objects. They're suggesting for leadership in the coming years, we create processes that encourage people to develop themselves, to develop their own strengths. So I'm just curious whether any of you guys in your companies are looking at shift in leadership in that perspective.
Happy to try and take a stab at that one. Of course. So people are probably #1 resource, obviously. Again, being asset light. We invest in our contracts and we invest in our people. And Mr. Marriott's motto is take care of your associates. The associates take care of the guests who then return and bring money to the business to make it successful. And so, I do appreciate a different look at how do you change the investment into the individuals, right? Because to give them more freedom, more flexibility. One of the things that we would typically do in a core training class is we sit everyone in this and we put up a bunch of PowerPoints and we tell them, here's what you need to know. Whereas today you can go on YouTube and watch a 15-second video about how to do something. And so that really is changing how we think about training and delivering that education to our associates. And so that's one of the things that we're undergoing is to get rid of kind of those past practices and to start embracing some new technology because, again, today, as we saw in the slides, a lot of people have a phone, right? It's very easy to get access and to watch a simple video on how to do something and let them make their own choices versus telling them it must be done this way. So thank you for asking.
And with that, please join me in thanking once again our panel. Thank you.